Theological Institute here at Holy Family Catholic Church. The last 2 weeks we've been having a dialogue on who wrote the Bible, when was the Bible written, and we began with the easier part. We know that the scriptures are divided into two. The Bible is divided into two parts. The first part we often refer to as the Old Testament, or when we are wanting to be more inclusive, we refer to them as the Hebrew Scriptures. Second half we refer to as the New Testament, or in a more inclusive spirit we refer to as the Christian Scriptures, the scriptures that have to deal with Christ. The last 2 weeks we've talked about the Christian Scriptures, who wrote the 27 books of the New Testament, who wrote them, when were they written, talking about some of that history and then carrying it forward. We know that those books were written in Greek and then needed to be translated into other languages. So we've talked about that. Which is the best English translation of scriptures? Depends. So we tackled the easier part of this first. Now tonight that brings us to the Hebrew Scriptures, which is a longer section. There are 46 books. 46 books, and whereas the Christian Scriptures were all written over some 100 years, the Hebrew Scriptures were written over a longer period of time. So, our handout, for those who are joining us on Facebook, there's a link below to the handout. The how, when, and why of the Hebrew Scriptures. How were the Hebrew Scriptures written? When were they written? Why were they written? The only answers that we have principally come from within the text. We have to read the Bible in order to get as many clues as we can about who wrote those books, where were those books written, why were those books written, etc. Some possible answers that come from the text. Well, the Bible tells us that Moses wrote the words of the covenant. The Bible also tells us that many rules in Leviticus and Numbers begin, the Lord said to Moses, or the Lord spoke to Aaron, those sorts of formulas. So if the Lord said this, if the Bible is setting up to who is this communicated to? The Lord said this to Moses. Boom. Okay, but is it that easy? We'll ask in just a moment. It's one thing to say that the Lord said something to Moses. I mean, anyone can say the Lord said these words to so-and-so. I imagine it would be tempting for us to put some words into God's mouth if we wanted to justify certain things. Deuteronomy suggests that it's an address by Moses to the Israelites on the plain of Moab. Samuel, the Bible says, wrote the rights and the duties of kingship. Solomon, according to the first book of Kings, wrote 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. Jeremiah dictated 2 sets of prophecies, the first of which was reportedly destroyed by King Jehoiakim. So the Bible is going to give us one set of answers of who wrote the Bible and when and why, etc. There are other clues that come from outside the Bible that give us some insights into it as well. For instance, there was a 2nd century work called the Talmud Baba Batra, in which it says that work suggested that Moses wrote almost all of Genesis through Deuteronomy. What do we refer to the first 5 books of the Bible as? The first 5 books of the Bible we call the Pentateuch. So Moses wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, plus Job, and it was that belief that endured. Pentateuch, Moses wrote Pentateuch, endured from the 2nd century until the 19th century. So for those of us who are here in this room, what we're learning here is actually something that's rather new in the history of the world. That's it. We just, for centuries, we handed on certain things that we thought, and only more recently have we critically been studying the Bible. We have about slightly over 200 years now of experience of interpreting the Bible in more critical ways. That same work tells us, or suggested, which is what we believe for centuries, that Joshua wrote Deuteronomy. The parts of the Pentateuch that talk about Moses' death, well, obviously Moses didn't write those parts that talk about his death, so we'll say that Joshua wrote those. And that Joshua wrote other books of the Bible, including Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and all of the Psalms that are addressed to David, since David could not have written the Psalms that were addressed to him. Jeremiah was given credit for Kings, Jeremiah and Lamentations. Hezekiah was given credit for Isaiah, Proverbs, and the Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. All other books were written by Ezra and men of the great synagogue. That was an easy answer. Who wrote the Bible? I'll tell you who wrote the Hebrew Scriptures. We'll break it down into these 5 or so people who wrote different parts of the Bible. How's that for an answer? That would be the easier answer, what we believe from the 2nd century to the 19th century of who wrote the Bible. And we just want to acknowledge up front that there are still some people who hold those views today. There are still some people who say that the Pentateuch was written by Moses. We're not judging those people. We're simply saying that that was a view that was held from the 2nd to the 19th century. Since then, there's been other scholarship, other views. Advantages of this paradigm, well, it's simple. Who wrote particular books that we can lay out? These are the 5 different people who wrote the Bible, and it seems pretty clear. And anyone who questioned that during this time was seen as challenging divine scripture. Who are you, Father Jamie, to challenge what it is that the church has believed for all these years? So that brings us to, after the 19th century comes the 20th century, the 1900s in plain English. Anyone old enough to remember the 1900s? So we're talking about more recent biblical scholarship. In the 20th century, we had 2 scholars, both of whom died in 1971. For those of us who are old enough to remember 1971. American scholar W.F. Albright and German scholar Gerhard von Rad. Albright reconstructed the historical and archaeological research of the Bible. And this is significant because that allowed us to date the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He gave us a date of about 1800 BC for them. Moses, the events of the Exodus, around 1200 BC. And then they set off looking for archaeological evidence to justify this. Well, is there anything that we can, if you didn't tell me, if I didn't have a Bible, is there anything that I can learn about the Exodus by digging around in the Middle East and seeing what I can find over there? So he gathered those sources outside the Bible. German scholar von Rad suggested that a lot of what we have in the Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, rotates around these 2 festivals. So for the sake of this evening, so we know that Israel, the land was such that in the north, the kingdom was known as Israel. In the south, the kingdom was known as Judah. The capital was in the south, so Jesus, who was from Galilee in the north, had to travel down to Jerusalem in the south. Jerusalem, being the capital then of this united kingdom, was the place where the king was. And so there's a certain advantage, if you're the king here, for you to build a temple and for you to oversee all religious affairs and to have various rules. The rules will help you to keep order in the kingdom, but could also be to your benefit. For instance, if you tell people that every year they have to make a pilgrimage from wherever they are, they have to stop what they're doing and come to Jerusalem for a feast or 2 each year, what does that mean suddenly for the economy of Jerusalem? That's a good thing for Jerusalem. So, there's something crafty in all of this for us to be thinking, of course, the scriptures are divinely inspired. That has been the traditional answer that we continue to say. But we're going to learn this evening as various human dynamics that might be at play behind this as well, which would lead a person to write a Bible. These things down for this? So, Jerusalem then. Let's see, the celebration of these feasts then, one feast for the occupation of the land, right, coming out of slavery and into the new land. The other was a feast of the giving of the law in Mount Sinai. Those feasts shaped the traditions. Because what happens when you gather people here, what it is that we start doing in this city, and the stories that we tell around that religion are going to influence what we think about our own religion. And we're going to get all sorts of people coming in. We're going to have the priests and those who maintain the temple. We're going to have people coming from all over. We're going to have a prophetic tradition. We're going to have all sorts of storytellers coming and joining us. So we're going to have the convergence of a lot of people on that place. The contemporary consensus then about the Bible is that Moses did not write the Bible in 1200. That the Bible is not that old. In fact, most persons date the Bible to after the time of the exile. So if the exile was in the 7th century BC, that means that the Bible was written after that. That means the Bible is about 2,600 years old at the oldest. So, what does this mean for us? If the Bible wasn't written in the time of Moses, or if the Bible wasn't written in the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, all the patriarchs and matriarchs, what does that mean? How did we get those stories from this time all the way down to here? That was 1,100 years of storytelling, of oral tradition, we call it. So anything that's told before this point, the 7th century BC, was passed to us through an oral tradition. The story of Abraham sacrificing his son, the story of a talking snake in a garden, and the original sin. Right? All these stories were passed on family to family for generations. Generations and generations. 1,100 years is a long time. It was right before this time that we started to see the emergence of states, which is important because before this, it was just tribes. Remember how there were various tribes that settled in these lands? And then they started coming together and forming this united kingdom. And they started creating these stories. One of the stories that was told is that what we have more in common than that which divides us. All of us, even though we're different tribes, we all descend from the same family or the same person. Jacob, who received the name Israel. We're all Israelites. Oh. So even though you are Edomites and you are Ammonites, and you are Jebusites, it's sort of like, even though we're different people, different tribes, we're all coming together now.
But this is all coming from Grandpa Rudy and his stories, right?
All of this, yes.
So, I mean, we know Jesus existed.
Yes.
Like that scientifically has been proven. But everything else in between that, we're hoping and trusting that they weren't like flubbing and adding to the stories.
Or even if they were adding to the stories, it still gives us insights to what they believed about God. Follow me? For them, the thought of a creation story, oh my, so this is really pressing me now. Because if the Bible was written in the 7th century BC, think back to the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. Wait a minute, those stories weren't being written down at that moment, follow me? It's not like there was a person there who was taking photos and making Facebook posts of a talking snake in the garden. These things were written down centuries and centuries later. Centuries and centuries and centuries later. So even if it didn't really happen, the Bible's not a book of history, the Bible is a book of theology. What it does is it tells us about what it is that these ancient people believed about God. They believed that God created the world and that God created the world good. But that human beings messed it up. Follow me?
It must have been just looking for a God that brought them together. Because they're tribes, all kinds of tribes. But when they believed that there was something superior to them,
And what we're going to see is there are different forces that are outside of us. So here we are in these little tribes. This is my tribe here. We're just the little people. And you know what? We've had our fights with y'all before. And we don't always agree and see eye to eye. But isn't there more value to us coming together as 12 tribes? Let's unite people. Because we have the Assyrians and the Persians and the Egyptians who, we are sandwiched between all these people, and if we're not united, we are going to be totally squashed. They're going to come in and take us over.
You know, I was thinking about over here in America.
Huh?
I mean, there were pyramids. They worshiped somebody out there, the moon or the sun. And that's one thing that brought them together, because they made pyramids, and the Mayans, the Aztecs, all over.
So we're going to see something similar here, because what's going to happen is we're going to have our ancient religions and our gods. You're going to have your gods. I'm going to have my gods. We're going to have different gods here. The question becomes, is there a way for us to come together and begin agreeing on what it is that we believe so that we can share this in common? And if we were to have some common stories, wouldn't that be a help? And or some common rules. Can we all agree that there is only one God? Call this God whatever you'd like, but let's just agree that there is one God. The name that we'll agree on is Yahweh. We didn't have the word God back then. We had various gods. Let's just agree that there is one supreme God, and this God's name is Yahweh. Can we all, for the sake of getting along, can we all agree on that? That you're God of war, and you're God of the corn, and you're God of the moon, and you're God of the sun, and all of this. We're going to bring all this together. We're going to believe in one God. We aren't there yet, though. It's going to take a moment. But stage are beginning to emerge. Just before the 7th century, before we start writing down these stories, we have the emergence of states, of tribes coming together and beginning to form. So the Bible is not so much a chronology, page 2, or a royal chronicle, but it's more a reflection on various decisions, what it is that we can learn. This book is going to teach us a lot about what we need to know to make good decisions and be successful as individuals, but more importantly as a people. How do we come together and survive in the midst of all of these threats, the biggest threats being Egypt to the southwest, the Assyrians to the north, and the Persians to the east. And as we know, the story is going to turn out such that we're going to have these forces pushing in on us and taking over our land at various times. We're going to be vassals, paying tributes, paying taxes to these other governments. The origins of Israel. So in the Bible, we refer to ourselves as Israelites, the Hebrews. These are the scriptures of the Hebrews and the Israelites. Where does that word Israel come from? The first reference to Israel comes from outside of the Bible. It comes from an inscription dated to about 1224 BC, where an Egyptian pharaoh, Merneptah, says, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. Historians know that Israel existed because we have historical records like this inscription. Someone chiseled in a stone that Israel is no more. And that was chiseled by someone here in Egypt, giving us the impression that somehow there was this conflict between people here in Egypt and folks that are referred to as the Israelites, that Israel is no more. Oh. So what an interesting record, especially since that's dated to about 1224 to 1200 BC, knowing that the traditional dating of the Exodus is to about this time period. So on one hand, we're telling stories about how we escaped from slavery, whereas other people are telling stories at that same time about how it was that they destroyed us. That becomes fascinating. Different stories now. So we conclude from that then that there was a tribe in Palestine that was known as Israel and recognized by this foreign power which was Egypt. The first non-biblical reference to Yahweh, to our God, says that Israel was ruled by Omri at the time, about 885 BC. So again, that's during this interim time here when states are forming. And the inscription there of King Mesha says, I took from there the vessels of Yahweh. Again, not a glowing picture of us. What does it show? Some foreign power, essentially saying they had all of these vessels or things that they made that they made for their God, and we took them. History is always written by the winners. Follow me. If you're the one writing the history, you're the one shaping how the story is told. Obviously, our Bible tells the story in one way. It casts us as strong, victorious winners with God on our side. It's interesting to find other sources that talk about us in a different way. They challenge us to see ourselves in a different light. Archaeological evidence. There is archaeological evidence that talks about a Trans-Jordan migration. Trans-Jordan. Remember the Jordan River goes from the north to the south of the Sea of Galilee on down closer to Jerusalem. So there's this migration coming across the Jordan to the hill country of Palestine, likely for political and or environmental reasons. Political, meaning, for instance, we're just trying to live our own peaceful lives here, away from other groups, the Canaanites, the Philistines, etc. Environmental reasons, what does that mean in plain English? We need food to survive. We need food and we need water. Makes sense for us to go for a place that has plenty of food and plenty of water. And we were struggling to survive. Judah was settled later and eclipsed Israel. So we settled first in the north, and then later, because the Assyrians attacked us in the north, then that's why Jerusalem became the capital in the south. The north fell to the Assyrians in 722 BC. Simply raising questions for those of us who study history that even though the Bible talks about this United Kingdom, there's nothing in any other historical documents that talks about anything that resembles the United Kingdom at that point. It's almost like what happens is when we do write the Bible, we cast our history in the best possible light, pulling on all sorts of stories of heroes and events that create something that we're excited to pass on to our kids and grandkids. So, even though we as Christians talk about this United Kingdom of people like David and Solomon, what's interesting is that all these other nations, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Persians, there's no other record of a King David. There's no other record of a King Solomon, which makes us simply pause and ask ourselves what's going on here, because if David was such a great king, if Solomon was such a great king, then why would other foreign powers not be talking about their trips to Jerusalem to meet with King David?
Because the Bible's a book of theology, not history.
That's exactly it.
But even somebody like myself, I still am now, I've been dealing with this for like a year already, and still to me
It's divinely inspired. It tells us about God. It's a tremendous book of theology. We're going to get a lot out of Scripture regardless.
Are there still any people that use the word Yahweh today? Because that means God, right?
It was an ancient name for God. To answer your question, yes, there are. Not a lot, though. Any of us old enough to remember in the 1980s, there was a famous Catholic song, Yahweh, I know you are near. Yahweh, I know you are near. It was essentially a song that used this ancient title for God.
So if there are people that use that word, are we talking about the same God? Yeah.
We believe in God. Yahweh comes for us to be the code name for this one God. And we haven't quite gotten to it yet, but what's going to be important is when we do band together, it's going to be important that we come up with common beliefs, like the creeds that we were talking about in the New Christian, when we had the empire, right? Constantine is using our religion to unite his empire, so he wants us all to believe the same thing. If we're going to come together, people, we need to be more or less on the same page, singing from the same hymn book or whatever the expression is, right?
Where did the name El Shaddai come from? Because I've heard Joel Osteen use El Shaddai, and I know there's a church right off of 183 called El Shaddai. I guess that's how you say it. I don't know. Church.
Yeah, so what happens? We have all sorts of ancient words. El Shaddai. The Shekinah is another ancient thing. What it was believed was that here in Jerusalem, if you wanted to be in the presence of God, the place to encounter God was going to be in this one place. Now we believe that God is in all places. You don't have to go to a holy family to meet God. But I say God is in all places. Back then, that wasn't necessarily the belief. That is, they believed that God was encountered in certain places. One of those places was in the temple. And so when you go into the temple, it was believed that God would make God's self manifest in this glorious shining forth of God that was known of as El Shaddai, sometimes known as the Shekinah. Sort of like the glorious appearance of God. God appearing in, think of the transfiguration when Jesus is transfigured. Sort of like that's the image that we have of God appearing in the temple to the priests and those who went behind the curtain. To Moses, when Moses was on the mountain. To Jesus and his disciples, when they saw him transfigured, was they saw God's glory. El Shaddai.
But they really didn't see him. Because it's not real. Kind of, sort of.
The Bible's not a book of history. The Bible's a book of theology. So what does that mean? We believed Grandpa Rudy told stories of people who were so holy that they saw God.
Oh, okay.
Moses was one of them. Moses was so holy that he could be in God's presence. A burning bush.
Stuff like that, it makes sense to me. But then, like earlier, you said something about they wrote somewhere in the Bible about Passover to get them to travel, and so how do we know that like parts of the Bible aren't too influenced, and that's really what is? I hope it makes sense. How do we know that that's what we're supposed to get from it, and it's not just something that was they were trying to influence them to do that? Like, I don't know. I don't want to be influenced like that.
You're right. So let's hold that question and come back to that question at the end of the evening, because it's important for us to sort of like lay out this history and then to step back from it and ask ourselves, what do we see? Was this just the machination of some king who, in order to protect ourselves from foreign powers, wanted to bring all these people together and the Bible became the instrument for that? Or is it possible that God could work through something like that? Certainly, the scripture scholars of the 20th century have a different way of looking on the Bible than those in previous centuries who just simply said, oh, well, Moses wrote the Pentateuch, end of story. That's all you need to know. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible? Moses. Contemporary scholars, ooh, we're going to see, we only have 1.5 pages to be able to tell the story in. They simply set forth how it is that maybe it's a little more complex than that. Competing Yahwisms. Yahwisms? Okay, so if we can all agree that there's only one God, Yahweh, the challenge comes that there are going to be different people telling different stories and worshiping this Yahweh in different ways. Follow me? In the same way that Catholics worship in a different way from Lutherans, Baptists, Episcopalians, Hindus, Buddhists. There are different people who worship in different ways. There are going to be 3 different Yahwisms, 3 different groups when it comes to Yahweh. One we're going to refer to as the official Yahwism, which is this group here in Jerusalem. So we have the temple with its priests who are going to be teaching one thing about our God. Popular Yahwism is going to be what the people believe. Sort of like the same in the church today, right? You have what Father Jamie preaches. You have what people at home believe. It's not saying that they're 2 different things or that they're in conflict or tension. It's just acknowledging that the faith of the people is sometimes slightly different from the faith of the church. Same with the Yahwisms. And then the third one is going to be this prophetic Yahwism. Especially in the north, we're going to have various prophets arising. And these prophets often going to be in conflict with these folks down here, the religious leaders. Think of Jesus in his day. Was he buddy-buddy with the religious leaders of his day? We have this prophetic element that just is in conflict with religious leaders. So the religious leaders are going to say, no, this is what we believe. The prophet's going to have another view of God. That this is what God is going to do. King Hezekiah, who has a group of scribes, meaning he gathers learned people around him. So for the sake of illustration, since we often, in the past, we referred to Jordan and Stephen as sort of like the scribal class. We referred to Grandpa Rudy as telling these stories. Jordan and Stephen being the scribes writing down these stories and trying to fit them with the Yahwism of the day. It was King Mario, let's continue the analogy here, who employed the scribes, fed the scribes, gave them a place to live, for them to do their thing. And we'll say that you were advised by a prophet in the north, we use a name like Isaiah. Heard of Isaiah before? That Isaiah advised this project. So now it's just not Jordan and Stephen doing it, but it's Jordan and Stephen with Isaiah's input who's bringing all these things together. Excuse me. Yeah, Isaac and Rebecca, those are stories from the south. So Jordan and Stephen are beginning with our stories in the south of Judahite heroes. But now that we're trying to extend our influence, what if we were to include their hero as well? Who is the hero in the north? Jacob. The Bible is not a book of history. The Bible is a book of theology. So instead of thinking of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as three generations, grandpa, son, and grandson, think of them more as Grandpa Rudy's collections of various hero stories. We're pulling together Abraham, who gave birth to Isaac, who gave birth to Jacob. Now all of our heroes are in the book that the scribes have now compiled for us. That was pretty crafty. We've been using the example of King Mario then, commissioning the scribes to write these stories. Now the scribes have written the stories of the heroes of these people that we can all be proud of. It's impossible to know what was contained in initial versions of the Hebrew scriptures, but we're imagining things like the Exodus story, the stories of the judges through Samuel and Saul, the laws that are in Exodus chapters 21 through 23. Those are more like ancient manifestations. Those were probably part of first drafts of the Bible. Other rules will come later. And the message that King Mario and the scribes are trying to give us is that there is one God, Yahweh, and this Yahweh chose us, the Davidic reign, chose us, King Mario, and our kingdom, to be God's chosen people. But we have to abide by certain rules. Like, thou shalt not eat pork. In this kingdom, we don't eat pork. Or catfish, or shrimp, or pepperoni pizza, etc., etc., etc. There are certain rules that we have in this kingdom. Trouble comes then after the scribes engage in this project and begin to write down these stories. The Assyrians attack from the north. We now become vassals of a foreign power, meaning we're paying taxes. We're now being ruled by foreign power. Page 14 of our notes. Sympathizers were in the 600s. At the end of this century, 640 to 609 is when sympathizers of the prophetic traditions of Yahweh, the people in the north, are going to put on the throne down here a boy, 8 years old, named Josiah. And Josiah is going to become the instrument. I mean, what do 8-year-olds know, really? Is the 8-year-old going to be telling us what to do? now this comes crafty, because now King Mario is no longer with us, may he rest in peace. But now, Jordan and Stephen have an 8-year-old boy on the throne. Question, who's making the decisions? The 8-year-old on the throne? Or the powers behind the throne? Josiah's reforms, then, what we're going to see is a reorganization, turning the Jerusalem temple into a national temple under King Mario and our predecessors. It wasn't a national temple, it was a royal temple. This is where King Mario went to pray. Follow me? We're going to turn into a national temple where people come and give a tenth of everything that they have. Oh, suddenly we're talking about bringing together resources. Follow me? If one of these laws is that thou shalt give 10% of everything that you produce on your land or of all your animals to the temple, and suddenly there's going to be that's going to be quite the institution. Josiah's reforms produced the vassal treaty. The vassal treaty that we have in Deuteronomy. What does that mean? The vassal treaties. Okay, now that we're being ruled by the foreign powers, we sort of get how it is to live under the rules of another person. So for those of us who are here in this kingdom, vassals that we are going to have that same relationship to God. Our God is going to protect us and guide us into the future, but we have to do what this God tells us to do. What does this God tell us to do? Read the Bible. Who wrote the Bible? Interesting.
Like the Constitution.
It would be like the Constitution. We now have this written document that all of us can refer to, that people can proclaim to other people. Right? This is the law of the Lord. This is what the Lord commanded to Moses. This is what the Lord spoke to Aaron.
As they went along centuries, they added more rules.
Yep.
They're not still adding anything to the Bible, right?
Say that again?
They're not still, like, the Constitution can be amended, the Bible's done, right? They're not adding to it anymore, right?
And they would be adding to it. So if the initial Bible had, in terms of laws, the initial Bible would have had, we're imagining like Exodus 21 through 23, 3 chapters, 21, 22, 23, Exodus, 3 chapters of laws. And then we keep adding laws to Exodus. We add laws to Leviticus, to Numbers, to Deuteronomy. Follow me? So instead of so there are two ways of seeing the Bible. One, just that God gave it to us all in one day. Here's the Bible. That's a very different view of the Bible. A more contemporary view of the Bible is something that evolved over centuries of various people writing down stories and rules at different times. The Persian period, in 587, the significant event in 587 was when the Persians came in and destroyed the temple. They took over our land, they destroyed the temple. According to our stories, we were exiled. It would take a lot for an army to exile the people 600 miles. But that was the story that we told. What happens is, now that we've been exiled, it's these stories that were written down become more important because they're going to shape our identity in a foreign land. We're no longer going to be able to come to a temple. So now we have to figure out how to be Jews, Israelites, in a period after the temple. We often refer to this period as the diaspora. We're now scattered. So we have to figure out how to be Israelites, how to be Jews, even though we're scattered. We're not going to be going back to Jerusalem this year. Sorry to break the bad news to you. Okay? So how do we be Jews where we are? The prophetic Yahwism ended with official Yahwism, because once the temple was destroyed, did we have all the priests who were at the temple? Yeah. Once that was gone, did we have all these prophets going down and telling them how bad they were? No, it's sort of like this event of 587, the destruction of the temple, the exile, sort of does away with our previous existence. The Persian period, 539 to 333, and 333, that's significant because that's when the Greeks are going to come in. So for 200 years, we're going to be under Persian rule. So the Assyrians first came in, conquered us. Now the Persians are coming in from the east. Under the Persians, at the time of the Persians, what happens is even though it's not business as normal here, there's still people who have these texts and who are still working on them. Jordan and Stephen are still writing away. So during this Persian period, they're editing the Pentateuch, meaning they're going through these 5 books of the Bible and editing them, right? We're updating them, seeing what we need to add, take out. They completed the prophetic books, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the minor prophets. All those are finished. The primeval history, Genesis chapters 1 to 11, dates to this period as well, which is significant because it was at this time that we were, presuming we were scattered to other lands. We talk about the exile. When you're in the exile with other people, you start hearing their stories. We've heard Grandpa Rudy's stories. With all due respect to Grandpa Rudy, we've heard his stories. Now we're in another land. We're hearing other people's stories, and their stories become part of our stories. Have you heard the story of a universal flood? That wasn't our story. That was a story that we got when we were in the exile. And Jordan and Stephen said, oh, that was a pretty cool story. That story can teach us something about God. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 then come from this time period, after we're among these people. The story of the destruction of the temple was added to the Bible because the temple was now destroyed in 587, so we could write that into the Bible. Solomon's prayer of temple dedication acknowledges Jews in the diaspora. This is what becomes interesting because now we're taking a look back at these stories, and even though a person like Solomon would have lived around 1000 BC, the stories that we're writing about him, because we're writing them now, are talking about Solomon using words as if Solomon was in the middle of our situation, with us being in the diaspora, scattered, and people no longer bringing the sacrifices to the temple. There is no temple. So how interesting that the prayer that we write of Solomon's dedication of the temple is in a time where there is no temple with sacrifices and when we're all scattered. We wondered if we could read those sections in the Bible. First book of Kings, chapter 8, verses 46 to 53. The other books that were completed in the mid-4th century, so in the same time period, we see Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Lamentations, and Ruth. And then the ones that we're not sure about that could have been completed after this time, after the Greek rule, are the books of Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Esther. Those could very well have been written after this time. There are some that we do know in the Old Testament of these 46 books. Some of them were written after 333, and those include the stories of the Maccabean revolt. Have you heard the book of Maccabees? There are 2 books called Maccabees, First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. The first book of Maccabees and the second book of Maccabees. Those are talking about events that happened in 168 BC. So if you're talking about events that are in 168 BC, obviously those books are going to be written at or after that time. At the time of the Maccabean revolt, then we're going to have the book of Daniel and the first and second books of Maccabees. All that to say then, we have this more full picture then of how it was that these 46 books of scriptures together during different time periods, but over more centuries. The New Testament, 27 books, came together over about 100 years. These came together from the 600s roughly to the time of Jesus. There's some books that are coming to us from closer to the time of the events of Jesus. So the Bible may be more complicated than we thought. Instead of thinking of it as a book that God just gave to us one day, I mean, that's a lot of words in that book. Maybe it's the case that it took this process over time of different people writing different stories, pulling different stories together, editing those stories, compiling them into what it is that we have today. There are 6 themes at the bottom of page 14 that sort of unite the Bible, though. The Bible is all sorts of writings, all sorts of books, but they have various common themes. Number 1, that Yahweh is the only God. Nowhere in the Bible do you hear talk of other gods. Well, actually, I don't want to misspeak. That is to say, there are times in the Bible we skipped over a point in here that talked about how it was that we moved from belief in various gods. That was back on page 12. I skipped over the point, letter D, Roman numeral number 1. Essentially in the Bible, we see this development of religious belief from polytheism, many gods. Right? We used to believe in many gods. We moved from that belief to henotheism, which is a belief that, yes, there are various gods, but our God is the principal God. Our God is number 1, numero uno. And then from there we move to the belief of our God is the only God, monotheism. How many gods are there? Only one. So in scriptures we have this belief. There's one God, and that God is our God, Yahweh. Number 2, we, Israel, are God's chosen people. Yes, there are other kingdoms on this earth, but they don't have a special relationship with God that we do. We are God's chosen people. Number 3, Yahweh chose the house of David to rule over Israel. How convenient that King Mario would help to propagate that belief. God chose us, meaning the kingdom of David, right? God chose David and Solomon and his descendants to rule over God's people. Number 4, belief in Jerusalem is the place to honor Yahweh. God is here in the temple. We'll build the temple here, and all people will come here to worship our God. Number 5, belief in God's law as revealed to Moses. 613 rules. I know it's a lot, but God gave them to us. I did not make these up. God gave them. God gave us 613 rules that we need to follow, according to this tradition. Number 6, belief that Yahweh will recreate the heavens and the earth, establishing a reign of peace and justice. This is important, leading us into, after this week, what we'll do is we'll spring into biblical apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature. The belief that what we have going on here is good and great, but our God in the end is going to be victorious. Despite all that's happening around us, despite the times when we suffer and are conquered, our God is going to come in and save us. Ultimately, the belief in the Messiah. Apocalyptic thought, I mean, we're going to be talking about the end of time, how it is that God is going to establish God's reign on this earth, a kingdom of peace and love and justice. For all the unjust people in this world, got news for you. God is going to step in and make things right. All the bad things that you see happening in the world, all the suffering, earthquakes, hurricanes, pandemics, wars, you name it. God is going to come into our history.
Using religion sometimes it also destroys society.
Religion can destroy society. Say more about it.
Well, like in Afghanistan now, the women, they're claiming that the women won't have any rights anymore like they did for a while.
And they're going to use religion to justify that. Right? So what I'm hearing is that different cultures.
Justify it. It's just like here in Texas now, with these rules that are being made, like it's political and religion gets into it also. Like the abortion issue. Abortion.
So how interesting. Politics comes from a Greek root, which has nothing to do with people. The polis, P-O-L-I-S in Greek is the people. So politics involves the people, and the people have religion. And so people's religious beliefs are going to shape their politics. And so if I'm a very conservative Muslim, a very fundamentalist Muslim, and we are all the same, then our politics are going to be shaped by that. Ooh, that's going to be fascinating. If we are conservative Christians, our politics are going to be shaped by that. And we're going to justify what we do by looking to the Bible or to our scriptures, to our religion.
Punishing the woman and, well, I know I'm getting into politics too, but punishing the woman, but not the man that got her pregnant, like incest. There's uncles, uncles, grandparents, they have abused children and girls. And now she has to have an abortion, but not to the man that did that. There's no punishment to him, only to the woman.
So I'm hearing religious beliefs, religious views are going to come to influence people's attitudes on various issues.
Are there any female voices in the Bible that females that wrote for the Bible? Because right here it says, what is it? All other books were written by Ezra and men of the great synagogue. Men of the great. Are there any women of the great synagogue?
So sadly, the Bible was written in a patriarchal, androcentric society, which simply means that there was a stratification of men and women. So what makes the Christian scriptures so significant is this concept of a discipleship of equals. That there is no male or female, free or slave, Jew or Greek. All of us are one.
Supposed to be equal.
So to answer your question directly, Steve, there's nothing in the Hebrew scriptures that we can point to and say there's a feminine voice here. There are a few feminine images. When we refer to God as a hen gathering the chicks under its wing, it's a feminine image, but there's nothing that we can point to and say this was written by the women of the synagogue.
Why would they have written books in women's name then?
That's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. We know that there are a few books in the Bible, Ruth, Esther. They're written in the name, they're written, there are stories of heroines. They lift up women as heroes. I need to think more fully on that. Why would they have written books on these heroines? Thoughts? Anything that comes to mind?
Kind of like what you were saying up here, where they're progressing, and it's just the thoughts, and eventually they did think about women. I could be wrong, but after the fact, they're like, okay, well, let's talk about women. But that.
I'm just imagining the value. I mean, I'm thinking there are various takes on it. One, I'm thinking about Grandpa Rudy, the storyteller, and how it was that, when the kids and grandkids asked Grandpa Rudy, about other stories, the Grandpa Rudy was telling stories not only about the heroes like Abraham, but he was telling stories that involved women too. But all of this within this patriarchal androcentric society that oppressed women in various ways and viewed women as property.
They still needed the cooperation of women to some extent,
Yeah,
though.
yeah.
So, up to today, I believed that the Bible was brought about, written due to divine inspiration,
Good.
but this seems to contradict that. I mean, if it was a gradual development of faith, and these are the 6 beliefs
Uh-huh.
that seem to come about, be revealed, where does divine inspiration come in on that?
That's an excellent question. I think these words are key, divine inspiration. I don't see anything in what we said this evening that robs from this idea of divine inspiration. I think it's just a different way of looking at divine inspiration. Was the divine inspiration to come down and speak with one person or a small number of people and say, here are the words, write it down? Or to see the Spirit, because that's ultimately what the word inspiration comes from, to see the Spirit working in those people who are bringing together these stories and trying to tell stories about what they believe about God. Terry, what are you thinking?
I just, it seems that, okay, so I thought that, like, by divine inspiration, for instance, Moses, okay. Moses was
Moses just-
spoken to by
There you
God.
go. And Moses had the pen in his hand,
Well,
Yes.
or the chisel. Moses had the chisel in his hand and said, speak, Lord, your servant is listening, speak.
but it seems that what this is saying to me is that it wasn't so much Moses that wrote the things that are here,
Right?
but these were written like way down the road. So how can,
But is it less inspired? What do you think about that question? I don't want to steal, knowing what I know about Jordan and Stephen, they are holy, good, well-intentioned people who are trying to teach us about God. So I'm not sure that it's any less inspired to say that it's written by the scribes, follow me there, than by Moses. But we have this traditional view. First 5 books of the Bible, who are they written by? Written by Moses. So we have this image of Moses using whatever it was that Moses wrote with back then, who was praying on Mount Sinai, or however he was doing that, and falling into a trance, and God using him to write those 2,000 pages. It could be. I'm not going to argue that that could be one possibility. I think scripture scholars simply now knowing that those scriptures don't seem to be written about the time of Moses, 1200 BC, that they don't date to then. Is it possible that that it's true that they date to other periods? And if so, are they any less divinely inspired, even if not spoken to Moses, say? They still contain the words spoken to Moses.
But they're
so that's
just,
where faith comes in.
that's just,
Yeah, there you go.
the stories that have been handed down. I mean, I keep going back to, these are just stories that people heard over 1,100 years, and how it could have changed every generation, or every time somebody told a story, it could have changed, differently. And so, I mean, it's like a storybook, which is completely opposite of what I've been told. I thought the Bible came straight out of God's mouth. I'm sorry, but
I hear the cognitive dissonance. believe my whole life.
Yeah, I mean, I just, I'm just blown away what you, and I followed you, and I'm like, oh my God, so many misinterpretations, so many different stories, and then just to get them all together and come up with one, that to me is.
And the story that was written 1,000 years ago is not going to be the same story that is told 1,000 years later.
Divine inspiration, I don't know if I'm misunderstanding what exactly that means, but to me, divine inspiration is not going to have anything man-made thoughts, I guess. Isn't going to have any, and a lot of what I heard tonight was like, somebody sitting here thinking, okay, well, how can we word this story to make sure we have complete and utter control over these people? So now I'm sitting here thinking, well, I don't doubt God, but crap, like where do I stand now?
Let's go back to the
We're all thinking the same thing, I think.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is cognitive dissonance. That is to say, we're used to thinking of something in one way. When you think of the Bible as divinely inspired, wait a minute, how does all this fit with the view of the Bible as being divinely inspired? For me, it doesn't. It doesn't change that for me. I have to think of divine inspiration in a different way. But I think what Terry says ultimately is, what it comes down to is, the question in Sunday's gospel is, what do you say? Okay, I hear what these other people are saying, but what do you say? What do you believe? And frankly, that's what's most important.
But
Right.
then again, our belief is going to be brought about by what we've been told or heard or learned.
Of course.
And so,
Yeah. So what Father Jamie is putting on the board this evening causes some cognitive dissonance with what it is that we may have learned in second or fourth or sixth grade religious education. And it's not good, bad, or there's no judgment here. It's simply different views of the Bible, right? There's one view of the Bible. Moses wrote the Pentateuch, boom, done, easy. It's easier to teach kids that than it is to give a class to second grade religious education students on the history of the Bible.
He's talking about us.
St. Paul said it perfectly. He said, when I was a child, I used to drink milk. I didn't eat meat when I was a child. So what a child learns in second grade religious education is one thing. What I learned as a child is one thing. What I learned as an adult, and it's too bad we don't have religious education classes for adults. Actually, this is our religious education class for adults, right? This is our religious education class for adults, because our religious education class for kids teaches us one thing at a second or fourth or sixth grade level. The adult religious education course, the adult Bible study, teaches us things ideally at a different level. Perhaps. But I say, I'm sure that there are Bible studies in this world for adults that offer milk instead of meat.
I need that class.
I need that class. Organize something else.
Sorry.
I would even say like what we discuss here at Bible study is different from church on Sundays, and that
Oh, yeah.
like on Sundays I feel like it's just like
just
scratching the surface, and then over here I just leave with more questions.
It just makes you think more.
So what we do during even this what we do on these nights, it's divided into two sections: Bible study and Theological Institute. The Bible study is taking the Word of God more as the Word of God divinely inspired. Theological Institute is simply taking a look at our faith through, let's say, a more mature lens, through a different lens. Asking more critical questions, thinking more reflectively on what it is that we're reading. Wouldn't want it to cause us to lose any sleep at night. You have my cell number. Text me if you're up at 3 o'clock in the morning, doubting your faith. I don't mean in any way for that to happen. It's simply us thinking about this in a different way. That is, for me, it caused me to lose no sleep thinking that the Bible is divinely inspired. There's no doubt in my mind that the Bible is divinely inspired. The Spirit is at work in the various persons who brought this together. Knowing that it's not a book of history, it's a book of theology. There's a lot that we can learn about God through this book. Even while understanding there's a complex book written in a certain context many, many years ago by certain persons who, let's just say, had an agenda. Various people who were writing the Bible had an agenda. If you were the king, you had one agenda. Probably had to do with the unity of your kingdom and the loyalty of your people. If you were scribes and religious leaders, you had another agenda. If you were a prophet in the north, you had another agenda.
Yeah. It's hard to get people to agree, but at least they agree that there's a God somewhere, you know? I mean, look at all kinds of religion believes that there is a superior person.
I just left thinking of the three Yahwisms. We talked about the three Yahwisms, right? The official teachings of those who were done at the temple, they were teaching one thing about God. The popular belief, you know, it's one thing for them to teach about God, etc. But you know what? My ancestors worshipped the gods in these trees. And so me and my family are going to continue to worship the tree gods in our part of the kingdom. There will always be the tension between official religion and popular religion, the religion of the people. And that's okay.
We're in the process of life.
The church has struggled with private revelations. I don't know if you've thought about this before, but anytime someone says that they saw Mary or saw Jesus, the church struggles with that because that's one person talking about his or her experience, and then suddenly, especially if other people start latching onto that, well, Mary spoke to me, and here's a book that I wrote on the revelations that Mary gave me. The church struggles with that because then suddenly we have this one set of beliefs that may or may not fit with another set of beliefs. What do you do with that? So, I don't want to leave us with this dichotomy of official versus private ministry. All of this is simply to say that scholars have been looking during the last 100, 150 years. There are other things that are coming to light now that we're learning more about history and archaeology that help us to look at these through another light.
Will the Bible ever be different than what it is today?
Ooh, excellent question. Possibly.
What would it take to do that?
So let's think through this. Would the Bible ever be different from what it is today? That would presume that we are adding to it or taking away from it. There are certainly voices that advocate for us taking away certain things, you know, certain stories, you know, that there are people who look at it through a certain lens, through the lens, say, of feminine liberation theology, where the Bible it continues to reinforce this oppressive system against certain people. What would it take for that to happen? It would take the decision of people to come together and to decide that for themselves, you know, either at a local level or at a larger level. I do recall a priest within the independent Catholic movement who said, we are no longer going to proclaim the second reading at Mass because so much of what St. Paul wrote is just so, it's written within that context of patriarchy and, you know, oppression. And he says in good conscience, I can't reinforce that worldview. Now for me, I step back from that, I see enough riches in Paul that I don't need to like throw out the entire second reading. But it's certain people like, you know, there are certain views that maybe there are some things that should be taken out of the Bible. It's conceivable that there could be things added to the Bible. We talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the 1970s. I mean, imagine once things like that are translated, if there were powers that be that were to say, this was written back at that time? You know? Is there some wisdom, is there something we can learn about God and or about the church that would make it of value to add that to the scriptures? interesting. The Qumran scroll, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or some other work that's discovered is found to be authentic. You know, that dates back to that period. It could contain stories of Jesus or of the early church. I don't know that any of that will ever happen in our lifetime. I just have not heard of anything being discovered. It would take a grand discovery.
I was thinking about, thinking about women, powerful women. A lot of, Mexico is one of the macho country, okay? But when it comes to the Virgin of Guadalupe, my God, I mean, they defend the mother, right? I mean, most men will care about the mom, the mother. Vale más que no le digas su la madre a uno, porque he'll fight you. Most Mexicans, they honor the Virgin of Guadalupe. I mean, the majority, I'm not saying, there's some people that don't, but the country is just so devoted to the Virgin of Guadalupe. Even though it's a macho country where they mistreat their wives, but not the mom.
This becomes this fascinating thing where the religion of the people, there's this belief among the people that this Aztec goddess is so important to various people. Let me recast those words a bit more carefully. This image of Mary in the image of an Aztec goddess is so important to these people historically that the official church has said, is there a way for us to bring this into our religion and accept it in order that these people might be part of our religion rather than their religion? Does that make any sense at all? Saint Juan Diego was an important thing for the Roman Catholic Church in 2002 because it was giving the people of Mexico a Mexican indigenous saint, even if he never existed. It was important for them to have this indigenous Mexican saint and to honor the popular religion of the people and to proclaim his canonization, to make him official. Armenia Guadalupe is fascinating, and the Mexican psyche and the Mexican American psyche, the place of Armenia Guadalupe, the mother of Christ, is fascinating.
But it seems like most Catholics all over, like in Spain, is La Virgen del Carmen.
So there's this interesting thing that even though this Bible is written in this androcentric patriarchal society, there is something about us that is less attracted to a powerful male god and is more attracted to a loving, right? Is it the end times? Let's talk about apocalyptic biblical literature beginning next week. Go put what's happening today in the context of what's been happening for the last 3,000 years that we've been telling these stories.
Hopefully it goes that way.
We've been hoping and praying and having faith for 3,000 years that somehow God will work through all the suffering in this world and bring to this world a world that is different from how this world currently is.
Well, I'm just going to say that the coach, the Texas coach, is from it's an Aramaic coach.
Okay?
He's from his ancestors come from Aramaic people.
I didn't know that. We conclude with a prayer. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Amen. World without end. We'll talk more about that in apocalyptic biblical literature next week. Have a great night.
That's scary.